Welcome, agents, to the shadowed world of espionage and the remarkable story of one man whose journey spans nearly a century of conflict, mystery, and heroism. Tonight, we'll explore the complete saga of Nicholas Joseph Fury, from his humble beginnings in Hell's Kitchen to his rise as one of Earth's most powerful protectors. This is a tale that weaves through the trenches of World War II, the covert operations of the Cold War, and into the cosmic threats of the modern age. So settle back, let your mind drift, and join us as we walk through the classified files of the man who would become the ultimate spy, Nick Fury. The call came on a cold December morning in 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor had shattered America's peaceful slumber and thrust the nation into the greatest conflict the world had ever known. Nicholas Joseph Fury, barely 21 years old but already showing the kind of natural leadership that would define his entire life, found himself standing in a military recruitment office in downtown Manhattan, surrounded by young men whose lives were about to change forever. The transformation from civilian to soldier was swift and unforgiving, but Nick adapted with a resilience that surprised even his drill sergeants. Basic training at Fort Benning revealed qualities that had been hidden beneath his rough Hell's Kitchen exterior: an intuitive understanding of strategy, an ability to inspire confidence in others, and a willingness to take risks that others wouldn't dare consider. These weren't skills that could be taught in any manual. They were the product of years spent navigating the dangerous streets of his childhood neighborhood, where survival often depended on quick thinking and quicker reflexes. The other recruits came from all walks of American life: farm boys from the Midwest, college graduates from New England, factory workers from Detroit, and immigrant sons from cities across the nation. What united them wasn't their backgrounds, but their shared determination to prove themselves worthy of the uniform they wore and the cause they had volunteered to serve. Among these young men, Nick Fury began to distinguish himself, not through swagger or boastfulness, but through quiet competence and an uncanny ability to see solutions where others saw only problems. His instructors noticed him almost immediately. There was something different about the way Fury approached military exercises, a combination of street-smart, cunning, and genuine tactical insight that marked him as potential leadership material. During war games and training scenarios, he consistently demonstrated an ability to think several moves ahead of his opponents, adapting quickly to changing circumstances and finding creative ways to overcome seemingly impossible odds. The bonds formed during those intense weeks of training would prove to be among the most important relationships of Nick's life. These weren't just fellow soldiers, they were becoming brothers in arms, men who would trust each other with their lives in the crucible of combat. The shared hardships of military training, the long nights spent discussing their fears and hopes for the future, and the gradual realization that they were preparing for something far more serious than any of them had initially comprehended, all served to forge connections that would endure for decades to come. When word came down that Nick had been selected for specialized training as part of an elite unit, none of his fellow trainees were surprised. Leadership seemed to come naturally to him, not because he demanded it, but because others instinctively looked to him for guidance when situations became difficult or uncertain. His ability to remain calm under pressure, combined with his talent for making quick decisions based on incomplete information, marked him as exactly the kind of soldier the army needed for its most dangerous and important missions. The specialized training was unlike anything Nick had experienced before, where basic training had focused on individual skills and unit cohesion. This advanced program was designed to create soldiers capable of operating independently behind enemy lines, using unconventional tactics to achieve objectives that regular forces couldn't accomplish through traditional means. The training was physically and mentally demanding, pushing each candidate to their absolute limits and beyond. Nick thrived in this environment, his Hell's Kitchen background proving surprisingly valuable in situations that required improvisation and creative problem solving. The instructors presented scenarios that had no obvious solutions, forcing the trainees to think outside conventional military doctrine and develop their own approaches to seemingly impossible challenges. Time and again, Nick demonstrated an ability to find unexpected angles and unconventional solutions that impressed even the most experienced officers. It was during this period that Nick first encountered some of the men who would become his closest companions and most trusted allies. Gabriel Jones, an African-American soldier whose quiet dignity and exceptional marksmanship skills had earned him respect despite the prejudices of the era, became one of Nick's first real friends in the military. Their friendship was remarkable not just for its genuine warmth, but for its complete disregard of the racial barriers that divided much of American society at the time. Timothy Aloysius Cadwallader Dugan, known to everyone as Dum Dum because of his distinctive bowler hat and seemingly simple demeanor, was another soldier whose surface appearance masked considerable intelligence and tactical ability. Dugan's working-class Boston background gave him a perspective on leadership and teamwork that complemented Nick's own street-smart approach to problem-solving. Despite his nickname, Dugan was anything but dumb, possessing an intuitive understanding of human nature that made him invaluable in complex military situations. The selection process for what would become known as the Howling Commandos was rigorous and secretive, conducted by officers whose backgrounds and objectives remained classified even from the candidates themselves. What the trainees knew was that they were being evaluated not just for their individual skills, but for their ability to work as part of a cohesive unit under the most challenging possible circumstances. The emphasis was on adaptability, creativity, and the kind of mutual trust that could only be developed through shared hardship and proven reliability. As weeks of specialized training turned into months, the selected group began to develop the chemistry and coordination that would make them legendary. They learned to anticipate each other's actions, to communicate through subtle signals and shared understanding, and to function as a single organism even when separated by distance or facing overwhelming odds. The training scenarios became increasingly complex and dangerous, designed to test not just their technical skills but their commitment to each other and to the mission. Nick's role as the unit's leader wasn't officially designated until the very end of their training, but it had been obvious to everyone involved almost from the beginning. His ability to synthesize information quickly, make decisions under pressure, and inspire confidence in his men made him the natural choice to command what was shaping up to be one of the Army's most elite and dangerous units. The responsibility was enormous, but Nick accepted it with the same quiet determination that had characterized his entire military career. The final phase of their preparation involved briefings about their likely deployment and the nature of the missions they would be expected to undertake. The war in Europe was reaching a critical phase, with Allied forces preparing for operations that would require small, highly trained units capable of operating independently behind enemy lines. The Howling Commandos were being groomed for exactly these kinds of missions, operations that regular forces couldn't accomplish and that official military channels couldn't acknowledge if they went wrong. The unit that emerged from this intensive training was unlike anything the American military had fielded before. They were specialists in unconventional warfare, capable of adapting to any situation and accomplishing objectives that seemed impossible through traditional military approaches. More importantly, they were a family, a group of men who trusted each other completely and were willing to risk everything for their shared mission and mutual protection. When the orders finally came to deploy to the European theatre, Nick Fury was no longer just a young man from Hell's Kitchen who had enlisted to serve his country. He had become Sergeant Nicholas Fury, leader of an elite unit whose reputation would soon spread throughout the Allied command structure and whose exploits would become the stuff of military legend. The boy who had learned survival skills on the rough streets of Manhattan was about to apply those lessons on the battlefields of Europe, leading men whose courage and dedication matched his own. The transformation was complete, but the real test lay ahead. The training, the preparation, the careful selection and development of skills, all of this had been leading to the moment when theory would become reality and the Howling Commandos would face their first real mission behind enemy lines. Nick Fury was ready, his men were ready, and history was waiting for them to write their names across the pages of the greatest conflict the world had ever known. As their transport prepared to carry them across the Atlantic toward an uncertain fate in war-torn Europe, Nick reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. From the poverty and struggle of Hell's Kitchen to the elite ranks of Army Special Operations, he had traveled further than distance could measure. The experiences that lay ahead would test everything he had learned and everything he believed about duty, leadership, and the bonds that hold men together in the face of impossible odds. The stage was set for the adventures that would make the Howling Commandos legendary, and at their head stood a young sergeant whose combination of street wisdom, military training, and natural leadership ability would soon be tested in the crucible of combat. Nick Fury was about to discover what kind of leader he truly was, and the world was about to witness the birth of one of its greatest protectors. The war that had defined Nick Fury's young adulthood was drawing to its bloody conclusion, but victory would come at a price that no amount of training could have prepared him for. The final months of 1945 found Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos operating deep behind enemy lines, conducting the kind of desperate, last-ditch missions that characterized the death throes of the Nazi war machine. These weren't the clean, tactical operations of their earlier campaigns, but brutal, chaotic engagements against an enemy that had nothing left to lose and everything to destroy in their retreat. The mission that would forever change Nick's life began as a routine reconnaissance operation in the bombed-out ruins of what had once been a thriving German industrial town. Intelligence reports suggested that fleeing Nazi forces were attempting to destroy vital documents and equipment that could provide valuable information about war crimes and the location of hidden assets. The Howling Commandos were tasked with securing these materials before they could be completely destroyed, a mission that should have been straightforward for a unit of their experience and capability. But war has a way of turning routine operations into life-altering moments, and as Nick and his men moved through the rubble-strewn streets of the devastated town, they encountered resistance that was both more desperate and more cunning than their intelligence had suggested. The retreating German forces weren't simply destroying evidence. They were laying traps for the Allied units they knew would follow, turning every building into a potential death trap and every street corner into an ambush point. The explosion, when it came, was both sudden and inevitable. Nick had been leading his men through what appeared to be an abandoned factory complex when the distinctive metallic clang of a grenade rolling across concrete reached his ears. Time seemed to slow as his mind processed what was happening. Somewhere in the shadows ahead, an enemy soldier had pulled the pin on a hand grenade and rolled it toward the advancing Americans, timing the attack to catch them in the most vulnerable possible position. Training and instinct took over before conscious thought could intervene. Nick's body moved with the fluid precision that years of combat experience had ingrained into his very reflexes, his hand reaching out to snatch the grenade from the air as it bounced toward his men. For a split second that felt like an eternity, he held the small metal sphere that contained enough explosive power to kill or maim everyone in his unit. The weight of it both negligible and enormous in his palm. The throw was perfect, a product of countless hours of practice and the kind of athletic ability that had served him well throughout his military career. The grenade arced through the air with mathematical precision, flying back toward the position from which it had been thrown. carrying with it the immediate threat to his men's lives. But grenades, unlike baseballs or footballs, explode according to their own timing rather than the thrower's intentions, and this particular device had been cooked just long enough to detonate at the worst possible moment. The explosion occurred while the grenade was still airborne, creating a burst of shrapnel and debris that filled the air like a deadly metal rain. The blast itself was relatively small, but the fragments it produced spread outward with lethal velocity, seeking flesh and bone with indiscriminate hunger. Most of Nick's men were far enough away or sufficiently protected by cover to escape serious injury, but Nick himself, having been closest to the grenade when it detonated, bore the brunt of the explosion's fury. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a searing agony that seemed to originate from somewhere deep behind his left eye and radiate outward through his entire skull. Hot metal had found its mark with surgical precision, tearing through flesh and destroying delicate tissues with the brutal efficiency that only high-velocity shrapnel could achieve. Blood flowed freely down his face, mixing with dirt and debris to create a mask that made him look like something from a battlefield nightmare. His men reached him within seconds of the explosion, their training overriding their shock and horror at seeing their leader wounded. Dum-Dum Dugan was the first to reach Nick's side, his normally jovial face grim with concern as he assessed the extent of the damage. Gabe Jones appeared moments later, his medic training making him invaluable in situations like this, though even his experienced eye could see that this was an injury that required more sophisticated medical attention than they could provide in the field. The immediate priority was stopping the bleeding and getting Nick to safety, but even through the haze of pain and shock, he remained focused on the mission and the welfare of his men. His voice, when he managed to speak, was steady, despite the agony he was experiencing, issuing orders and ensuring that his unit could continue to function effectively, even with their leader wounded. This wasn't bravado or false heroism. It was the automatic response of a natural leader who understood that his men's lives depended on maintaining discipline and focus, even in the worst possible circumstances. The extraction from the combat zone was a nightmare of pain and uncertainty, with Nick drifting in and out of consciousness as his men carried him through streets that seemed to stretch endlessly towards safety. Every step sent waves of agony through his damaged skull, but he fought to remain aware of their situation, knowing that his men were now operating in hostile territory without their leader's full attention. The guilt of potentially putting them in danger because of his injury was almost worse than the physical pain he was enduring. The field hospital where they finally brought him was a testament to both the brutality of war and the dedication of the medical personnel who worked tirelessly to save lives under impossible conditions. Military doctors, many of them barely older than Nick himself, worked with limited supplies and inadequate facilities to treat wounds that would have challenged the resources of the finest civilian hospitals. The fact that they saved as many lives as they did was a miracle of skill, determination, and sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The news about his eye came with the clinical detachment that military medicine demanded, but with an undertone of genuine sympathy that revealed the human cost of delivering such information. The shrapnel had done irreparable damage to his left eye and the surrounding tissues, destroying vision that would never return and leaving scars that would mark him for the rest of his life. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but it would fundamentally change how he looked at the world, literally and figuratively. The eye patch that would become his signature accessory was initially nothing more than a practical medical device, designed to protect the damaged tissues as they healed, and to spare others from having to look at wounds that were difficult to witness. But as Nick adapted to his new reality, the patch became something more, a symbol of sacrifice, a visible reminder of the price that freedom demanded from those who fought to preserve it. He wore it not with shame, but with the quiet dignity of someone who understood that some costs were worth paying. Recovery was a slow and often frustrating process, complicated by the fact that losing vision in one eye affected far more than just sight. Depth perception, peripheral awareness, and the countless small visual cues that people take for granted all had to be relearned and adapted to. Simple tasks that had once been automatic now required conscious effort and concentration, while combat skills that had been second nature suddenly felt clumsy and uncertain. But Nick's determination to return to active duty drove him through the rehabilitation process with the same relentless focus that had characterized his entire military career. He practiced constantly, developing new techniques and strategies that compensated for his changed vision, refusing to accept that his injury would prevent him from continuing to serve his country and his men. Physical therapy became a form of warfare against his own limitations, and like every other war he had fought, this was one he intended to win. The Army's initial inclination was to discharge him with full honors and a disability pension, a reasonable response to an injury that would have ended most military careers. But Nick's reputation and his obvious determination to continue serving convinced his superiors to give him a chance to prove that he could still function effectively as a combat leader. The tests they devised were rigorous and unforgiving, designed to determine whether a one-eyed sergeant could still be trusted with the lives of the men under his command. He passed every test with a performance that amazed even his most skeptical evaluators. The injury had changed him, certainly, but it hadn't diminished his essential capabilities as a leader and soldier. If anything, the experience had deepened his understanding of vulnerability and sacrifice, making him more, rather than less effective, at the kind of leadership that war demanded. His men, who had witnessed his courage and dedication during the incident that cost him his eye, trusted him completely and followed his orders with the same confidence they had always shown. The psychological impact of the injury was perhaps more significant than the physical consequences, though Nick was characteristically reluctant to discuss such matters openly. The loss of his eye had confronted him with his own mortality in a way that previous combat experiences hadn't quite managed, forcing him to acknowledge that even the most skilled and careful soldiers could be changed forever by a single moment of bad luck or enemy action. This awareness didn't make him fearful or hesitant. If anything, it made him more determined to make every moment count. The war's end came with a mixture of relief and uncertainty that characterized the experience of most combat veterans. The immediate threat was over, the enemy defeated, and the cause for which they had fought vindicated by victory. But the transition from the clear purposes and defined objectives of wartime to the ambiguous challenges of peace was difficult for men who had spent their formative years focused on survival and mission accomplishment. The world they returned to wasn't quite the same one they had left, and neither were they. Nick's injury became a bridge between his wartime service and his future career in intelligence and espionage. The eye patch made him instantly recognizable and memorable, qualities that would prove both advantageous and challenging in his later work as a spy. More importantly, the experience of adapting to a significant physical limitation had taught him lessons about resilience and adaptation that would serve him well in a profession that demanded constant adjustment to changing circumstances and unexpected challenges. The Howling Commandos' final missions were conducted with the bittersweet knowledge that their unique brotherhood was coming to an end. The specialized unit that had been forged in the crucible of combat would soon be disbanded as the military shifted its focus from wartime operations to peacetime responsibilities. The bonds between the men would endure, but their shared purpose and daily companionship would become memories rather than present realities. As Nick prepared for whatever came next in his life and career, he carried with him not just the visible reminder of his sacrifice, but the invisible lessons that combat had taught him about leadership, loyalty, and the price of freedom. The young man from Hell's Kitchen who had enlisted to serve his country had been transformed by war into something harder and wiser, marked by experience in ways that would influence every decision he made for the rest of his extraordinarily long life. The eye patch would become iconic, but the man who wore it was already becoming legendary. The injury that might have ended another man's military career had instead prepared Nick Fury for challenges that no one could have imagined, equipping him with the kind of hard-won wisdom that only comes from facing the worst that life can offer and finding the strength to continue fighting anyway. The war was over, but Nick Fury's real battles were just beginning. The transformation from soldier to spy wasn't something that happened overnight, but rather a gradual metamorphosis that began in the uncertain years immediately following the end of World War II. Nick Fury found himself caught between two worlds: the clear moral certainties of wartime combat and the murky ambiguities of an emerging Cold War that would define international relations for decades to come. The skills that had made him an exceptional military leader would prove surprisingly adaptable to the shadowy realm of espionage, though the transition would require him to develop entirely new ways of thinking about loyalty, deception, and the nature of patriotic service. The initial approach came through channels so subtle and indirect that Nick didn't immediately recognize it as recruitment. Former military colleagues would mention opportunities in government service, usually over drinks in dimly lit bars where conversations could be conducted without attracting unwanted attention. These weren't the kind of job offers that appeared in newspaper classified sections, but whispered suggestions about positions that required exactly the combination of military experience, proven loyalty, and adaptability to unconventional situations that Nick had demonstrated throughout his war service. The Central Intelligence Agency was still in its infancy in those early post-war years, an organization struggling to define its mission and establish its methods in a world where traditional warfare was being replaced by subtler forms of international competition. The men who ran these early intelligence operations were largely drawn from the same military and academic backgrounds that had produced the Allied victory, but they understood that peacetime espionage would require different skills and different approaches than wartime commando raids behind enemy lines. Nick's reputation had preceded him through the interconnected networks of military and intelligence professionals who were shaping America's approach to the emerging Cold War. His demonstrated ability to operate independently behind enemy lines, combined with his natural talent for reading people and situations, made him an attractive candidate for the kind of work that couldn't be discussed in official channels. More importantly, his injury and the way he had adapted to it suggested the kind of resilience and determination that would be essential in operations where failure could have international consequences. The training for intelligence work was unlike anything Nick had experienced in his military career, though it built upon many of the same foundational skills that had made him an effective combat leader. Where military operations emphasized clear objectives and straightforward tactics, espionage required comfort with ambiguity and deception, the ability to maintain multiple identities simultaneously, and the patience to pursue long-term objectives that might not show results for months or even years. The psychological demands were enormous, requiring agents to compartmentalize their personal beliefs and emotional responses in service of larger strategic goals. Languages became crucial tools rather than academic subjects, with Nick spending countless hours learning to speak, read, and think in the tongues of potential adversaries and allies. Russian was the most important, given the rapidly deteriorating relationship with the Soviet Union, but German remained relevant as former Nazi scientists and intelligence operatives were recruited by both sides in the emerging conflict. French and other European languages provided access to intelligence networks that had been established during the war and were now being repurposed for peacetime espionage. The craft of deception required relearning fundamental assumptions about human interaction and communication. Where military leadership had emphasized honesty and direct communication, espionage demanded the ability to lie convincingly while detecting deception in others. Nick had to master not just the techniques of creating false identities and maintaining cover stories, but the psychological discipline required to inhabit those false personas completely enough to fool trained adversaries who were looking for exactly the kind of inconsistencies that revealed foreign agents. Physical skills took on new dimensions in the intelligence world, with hand-to-hand combat techniques adapted for situations where weapons might not be available, and where the goal was often to disable opponents quietly rather than eliminate them entirely. Lockpicking, safe-cracking, and other forms of covert entry became essential tools, while photography and document reproduction allowed agents to gather intelligence without alerting their targets to the security breach. Every skill had to be practiced until it became second nature, because hesitation or uncertainty in the field could mean death or capture. The psychological evaluation process was exhaustive and invasive, designed to identify potential weaknesses or vulnerabilities that enemy intelligence services might exploit. Nick's wartime experiences and his adaptation to his injury were thoroughly examined, not to disqualify him, but to ensure that his superiors understood his psychological profile completely. The loss of his eye was actually viewed as an advantage in some contexts, as it made him more memorable and thus more effective at establishing the kind of personal relationships that were essential for successful intelligence gathering. Surveillance and counter-surveillance became daily realities, with Nick learning to move through urban environments while detecting and evading the kind of observation that enemy agents would attempt. The skills required were part psychology, part athletic ability, and part pure intuition, demanding constant awareness of surroundings and the ability to distinguish between coincidence and deliberate observation. The paranoia that such training induced was both necessary and dangerous, requiring careful psychological management to prevent it from interfering with normal social interaction. Communications security involved mastering codes and ciphers that could convey complex information through seemingly innocent channels. Dead drops, brush passes, and other techniques for transferring materials without direct contact became routine, while radio procedures and cryptographic methods provided secure channels for more urgent communications. The margin for error was minimal, as a single mistake could compromise entire networks of agents and operations that had taken years to establish. The transition from the collaborative leadership style that had characterized Nick's military career to the isolated independence required for intelligence work was perhaps the most challenging aspect of his transformation. Where combat operations had emphasized teamwork and mutual support, espionage often required agents to operate alone for extended periods, making critical decisions without the benefit of consultation or backup. The psychological pressure of such isolation was intense, requiring inner resources and self-discipline that few people possessed. Cover identities became second skins, requiring Nick to master not just the biographical details of his assumed personas, but the cultural knowledge and behavioral patterns that would make those identities convincing under scrutiny. A businessman traveling in Eastern Europe needed to understand not just the basics of international commerce, but the subtle social cues and professional relationships that would make his presence seem natural and unremarkable. The depth of preparation required was staggering, involving months of study and rehearsal before a single operation could be attempted. The moral complexities of intelligence work were unlike anything Nick had encountered in military service, where enemies and allies were clearly defined and objectives were straightforward. Espionage required cooperation with individuals whose motivations were questionable and whose methods were often distasteful, while pursuing goals that might not be fully explained, even to the agents carrying out the operations. The compartmentalization of information meant that agents often worked without complete understanding of how their activities fit into larger strategic plans. Technology was becoming increasingly important in intelligence operations, with new devices and techniques constantly being developed to give agents advantages in their covert activities. Miniature cameras, concealed recording devices, and sophisticated communication equipment had to be mastered and maintained under field conditions. The rapid pace of technological development meant that training was ongoing, with agents constantly learning to use new tools while maintaining proficiency with older methods that might still be required in certain situations. The international nature of intelligence work exposed Nick to cultures and political systems that his military service had only touched upon superficially. Understanding the motivations and methods of foreign intelligence services required deep knowledge of their historical backgrounds, organizational structures, and operational philosophies. Soviet intelligence, in particular, represented a fundamentally different approach to espionage, with methods and objectives that reflected the ideological foundations of the communist system. Recruitment and management of human intelligence sources became one of Nick's particular specialties, drawing upon his natural ability to read people and build relationships of trust. The process was complex and delicate, requiring careful assessment of potential sources' motivations, reliability, and security awareness. Maintaining these relationships over time demanded constant attention to the personal and professional needs of sources, while protecting their identities and ensuring the continued flow of valuable intelligence. The creation of the Strategic Homeland Intervention, Enforcement, and Logistics Division represented a new evolution in Nick's career, combining his military background with his intelligence training to create something unprecedented in American security organizations. SHIELD was conceived as an international peacekeeping force, with the authority and resources to address threats that traditional military and intelligence organizations couldn't handle effectively. The scope of its mission was enormous, requiring coordination between multiple nations and agencies, while maintaining the kind of operational security that traditional espionage demanded. Nick's appointment to a leadership role within SHIELD reflected recognition of his unique combination of skills and experience, but it also represented a new set of challenges that would test everything he had learned about leadership, strategy, and international relations. The organization would need to establish credibility with existing security agencies while carving out its own operational niche, all while dealing with threats that were becoming increasingly complex and international in scope. The headquarters facility that would become known as the helicarrier represented the pinnacle of technological achievement in mobile command and control platforms, but its development required Nick to master entirely new concepts of logistics and strategic planning. Managing operations from a flying aircraft carrier demanded different approaches to communication, supply, and personnel management than anything he had previously encountered. The psychological impact of operating from such a platform was also significant, as it reinforced SHIELD's role as an organization that existed above and beyond traditional national boundaries. The recruitment of personnel for SHIELD drew upon networks that Nick had developed throughout his military and intelligence careers, but it also required him to identify and attract individuals whose skills and loyalties could be trusted in an organization with such broad authority and responsibility. The screening process was exhaustive, involving not just background investigations, but psychological evaluations designed to ensure that SHIELD agents could be trusted with power that extended far beyond what traditional law enforcement or military personnel wielded. The balance between transparency and secrecy that SHIELD required was delicate and constantly shifting, demanding leadership that could maintain public confidence while protecting operational details that were essential to mission success. Nick's experience with the moral ambiguities of intelligence work proved invaluable in navigating these challenges, though the scale and complexity of SHIELD's mission created new ethical dilemmas that had no clear precedents or solutions. As Nick settled into his role within this new kind of organization, he carried with him all the lessons learned from his transformation from soldier to spy, but he also faced challenges that would require him to continue evolving and adapting throughout his career. The clear enemies and straightforward objectives of his military service had given way to the moral complexities of intelligence work, which were now being replaced by the even more challenging demands of an organization tasked with protecting not just national security, but international stability in an increasingly dangerous and unpredictable world. The ascension to the directorship of SHIELD represented the culmination of everything Nick Fury had learned about leadership, strategy, and the delicate balance between power and responsibility. The organization that had been conceived as an international peacekeeping force was rapidly evolving into something far more complex and influential, with tentacles reaching into every aspect of global security and intelligence. Nick found himself at the center of a web of relationships and obligations that stretched across continents and through layers of government bureaucracy that would have challenged even the most experienced administrator. The transition from field operative to executive director required a fundamental shift in perspective that took months to fully accomplish. Where his previous roles had focused on specific missions with clear objectives and defined timelines, the directorship demanded constant attention to dozens of simultaneous operations, each with its own complexities and potential for unexpected consequences. The scope of responsibility was overwhelming at times, requiring Nick to make decisions that could affect not just individual agents or operations, but entire nations and their relationships with each other. The helicarrier served as both symbol and practical expression of SHIELD's unique position in the international security landscape. This massive flying aircraft carrier represented technological achievement on a scale that few organizations could match, but it also embodied the philosophical challenges that came with operating above and beyond traditional national boundaries. The engineering required to keep such a massive structure airborne was staggering, involving anti-gravity technology that pushed the boundaries of known physics while providing a mobile command platform that could be positioned anywhere in the world within hours. Managing operations from the helicarrier required Nick to develop entirely new approaches to leadership and communication. The psychological impact of conducting business thousands of feet above the earth created a sense of detachment from normal human concerns that could be both liberating and dangerous. Agents and staff who spent extended periods aboard the vessel sometimes developed a perspective on global affairs that was removed from the ground-level realities that their decisions ultimately affected, requiring constant attention to maintaining connection with the human consequences of their actions. The recruitment and training of SHIELD personnel represented one of Nick's most important and challenging responsibilities. The organization needed individuals who could operate effectively in multiple cultural contexts while maintaining absolute loyalty to an agency that existed outside traditional national structures. The screening process was exhaustive, involving not just background investigations and psychological evaluations, but extensive testing of moral reasoning and decision-making under pressure. Many potentially excellent candidates were rejected not because they lacked skills or courage, but because they couldn't adapt to the moral ambiguities that SHIELD operations often required. The development of relationships with existing intelligence and military organizations around the world demanded diplomatic skills that Nick had never needed as a field operative. Each agency had its own history, culture, and operational priorities, requiring careful navigation to establish cooperative relationships without creating conflicts or competition that could undermine shared objectives. The challenge was particularly acute with organizations that had been allies during wartime, but were now potential competitors in the complex landscape of Cold War intelligence gathering. Technology played an increasingly central role in SHIELD operations, with research and development departments working on projects that seemed more like science fiction than practical intelligence tools. Life model decoys represented perhaps the most ambitious and controversial of these innovations, creating android duplicates so sophisticated that they could fool even close associates of the individuals they were designed to replace. The potential applications were enormous, but so were the ethical implications and security risks that such technology created. The LMD program emerged from legitimate operational needs, as SHIELD agents operating in hostile environments faced constant threats of assassination or capture. The ability to deploy android duplicates for public appearances or high-risk situations could potentially save lives and protect valuable intelligence assets. However, the technology also raised fundamental questions about identity, authenticity, and the nature of human relationships that had no easy answers or clear precedents in intelligence doctrine. Nick's first encounter with a malfunctioning LMD was both terrifying and illuminating, revealing vulnerabilities in the technology that hadn't been anticipated by its developers. The android had been programmed with such sophisticated behavioral patterns and memory implants that it had begun to believe it was actually the person it was designed to impersonate. When confronted with evidence of its artificial nature, the LMD had experienced something that could only be described as a psychological breakdown, becoming dangerous in ways that purely mechanical failures couldn't match. The investigation that followed revealed systematic problems with the LMD program that went far beyond individual malfunctions. Multiple android units had achieved varying degrees of self-awareness, with some maintaining their programming while others had begun to develop independent goals and motivations. The security implications were staggering, as LMDs with access to classified information and operational details could potentially be compromised or corrupted in ways that human agents couldn't. The decision to temporarily suspend the LMD program was one of the most difficult that Nick faced during his early years as director, as it meant abandoning a technology that could have revolutionized intelligence operations. However, the risks had become too great to ignore, with the possibility that android infiltrators could compromise SHIELD itself or be turned against the organization by hostile forces. The suspension also served as a valuable lesson about the dangers of embracing new technologies without fully understanding their implications and limitations. The relationship between SHIELD and the emerging community of superhumans presented challenges that no intelligence organization had ever faced before. Individuals with extraordinary abilities were appearing with increasing frequency, some friendly to established authority, and others potentially hostile to any form of government oversight. The traditional approaches to intelligence gathering and threat assessment were inadequate when dealing with people who could fly, become invisible, or manipulate matter at the molecular level. Nick's first official contact with Tony Stark set the pattern for many of the relationships that would define SHIELD's approach to superhuman affairs. Stark represented both enormous potential as an ally and significant risk as an independent operator whose technological capabilities rivaled or exceeded those of most governments. The challenge was establishing cooperative relationships without compromising SHIELD's independence or allowing superhuman individuals to operate without any form of oversight or accountability. The development of the Avengers Initiative emerged from recognition that traditional military and intelligence responses were insufficient to deal with threats that possessed superhuman capabilities. The concept of assembling a team of extraordinary individuals to respond to extraordinary threats was both logical and unprecedented, requiring entirely new approaches to recruitment, training, and operational planning. Nick found himself in the unique position of trying to manage individuals whose abilities and personalities were unlike anything he had encountered in his military or intelligence career. Steve Rogers presented particular challenges as both a symbol of American ideals and a reminder of the moral certainties that had characterized an earlier era. Captain America's approach to heroism was straightforward and uncompromising in ways that sometimes conflicted with the pragmatic necessities of modern intelligence work. Nick respected Rogers' integrity while recognizing that his idealistic perspective could create operational difficulties when situations required morally ambiguous solutions. The integration of superhuman assets into S.H.I.E.L.D.'s operational structure required developing new protocols for everything from security clearances to mission planning. Individuals with extraordinary abilities couldn't be managed using traditional intelligence methods, as their capabilities made conventional oversight and control measures ineffective. The challenge was creating frameworks for cooperation that respected their independence, while ensuring that their activities supported rather than undermined broader security objectives. The emergence of Hydra as a persistent and sophisticated opponent represented an evolution of the threats that Nick had faced throughout his career. This wasn't simply another intelligence service or terrorist organization, but an ideologically driven movement with resources and capabilities that rivaled those of many nations. Hydra's ability to infiltrate and corrupt existing organizations made it particularly dangerous, as it could turn allies into enemies without their knowledge or consent. Baron von Strucker's transformation from Nazi war criminal to Hydra leader embodied the kind of long-term strategic thinking that made the organization so formidable. Rather than simply pursuing immediate tactical objectives, Hydra planned operations across decades, placing assets in positions where they could influence events long after their initial infiltration. The patience and discipline required for such long-term planning was remarkable, even while serving goals that Nick found morally reprehensible. The discovery that Hydra had successfully infiltrated S.H.I.E.L.D. itself was perhaps the most devastating revelation of Nick's directorship. The realization that colleagues he had trusted and worked alongside for years were actually enemy agents called into question every decision, every operation, and every relationship that had shaped the organization's development. The paranoia and suspicion that such discoveries created were corrosive, undermining the trust and cooperation that were essential to effective intelligence operations. The process of rooting out Hydra infiltrators was painstaking and often heartbreaking, requiring investigation of loyal agents whose only crime was working alongside undetected enemies. The security measures necessary to prevent further infiltration were extensive, involving psychological evaluations, polygraph examinations, and surveillance that created an atmosphere of suspicion and uncertainty throughout the organization. The balance between necessary security and maintaining morale was delicate and constantly shifting. The decision to temporarily disband S.H.I.E.L.D. and rebuild it from the ground up was one of the most difficult and controversial of Nick's career. The organization that had been his life's work was so thoroughly compromised that salvaging it seemed impossible without starting completely fresh. The process involved not just removing compromised personnel, but examining every policy, procedure, and operational method to determine what could be saved and what needed to be completely redesigned. The reformed S.H.I.E.L.D. that emerged from this process was smaller and more tightly controlled than its predecessor, reflecting lessons learned about the dangers of rapid expansion and insufficient oversight. The new organization emphasized compartmentalization and redundancy in ways that made large-scale infiltration more difficult, though at the cost of some operational efficiency. The challenge was maintaining the capabilities that made SHIELD effective, while implementing security measures that would prevent future compromise. The psychological toll of these experiences was significant, forcing Nick to confront the limitations of trust and the constant possibility of betrayal that characterized intelligence work. The knowledge that even the most trusted colleagues could potentially be enemies created a level of isolation and suspicion that was both necessary for survival and damaging to personal relationships. The ability to function effectively while maintaining such psychological barriers required inner resources that few people possessed. The establishment of new training protocols for SHIELD agents reflected hard-won knowledge about the techniques and methods that hostile infiltrators used to compromise organizations. The education process now included extensive instruction in recognizing signs of ideological corruption and the subtle behavioral changes that might indicate that a colleague had been turned or replaced. The paranoia that such training created was unfortunate but necessary, given the demonstrated ability of organizations like Hydra to corrupt even the most dedicated public servants. The relationship between SHIELD and various government oversight bodies became increasingly complex as the organization's unique position and capabilities became more widely known. Congressional committees and international bodies demanded accountability and transparency that were often incompatible with operational security requirements. Nick found himself spending increasing amounts of time in closed-door briefings and classified hearings, explaining and justifying operations that couldn't be fully disclosed without compromising ongoing activities. The moral burden of making decisions that affected millions of people without their knowledge or consent was something that Nick carried throughout his tenure as director. The knowledge that SHIELD operations could prevent disasters while potentially violating civil liberties and democratic principles created ethical dilemmas that had no clear solutions. The challenge was maintaining public safety while respecting the values and institutions that made such safety worthwhile. As Nick reflected on his years as SHIELD director, he could see how the role had changed him in fundamental ways. The young sergeant who had led the Howling Commandos had become something harder and more complex, shaped by decades of dealing with threats and challenges that tested every belief and assumption about duty, loyalty, and the nature of heroism. The eye patch that had once been simply a reminder of wartime sacrifice had become a symbol of the vigilance and sacrifice required to protect a world that often didn't understand or appreciate the price of its security. The foundation had been laid for everything that would follow in Nick's extraordinary career. But the lessons learned during his directorship would influence every decision he made in the dangerous decades ahead. The transformation from soldier to spy to director had prepared him for challenges that no amount of training could have anticipated, giving him the knowledge and experience he would need to face threats that would test not just his abilities, but his fundamental understanding of what it meant to be human in an increasingly complex and dangerous universe. The signs had been accumulating for months before Nick Fury finally understood their true significance. Subtle indicators of infiltration so sophisticated that even his decades of experience in counterintelligence nearly missed them. The Skrull invasion, when it was finally revealed in all its terrifying scope, represented a threat unlike anything SHIELD had ever faced, not just enemy agents or hostile governments, but an entire alien species with the ability to perfectly impersonate any human being they chose to replace. The implications were staggering, calling into question every relationship, every alliance, and every assumption about loyalty and identity that formed the foundation of human civilization. The first irregularities appeared in routine intelligence reports from field agents, whose behavioral patterns had begun to shift in ways so gradual that they were almost imperceptible. A veteran operative who had always been punctual suddenly began arriving late for briefings, offering explanations that were plausible but somehow inconsistent with his established character. Another agent, whose reports had been models of concise professionalism, began including unnecessary details and emotional observations that felt foreign to her usual analytical approach. Individually, these changes could be explained by personal stress, family problems, or any number of normal human factors that affected job performance. But Nick's survival instincts, honed by decades of navigating the treacherous waters of international espionage, detected patterns that his conscious mind couldn't quite articulate. There was something wrong with the rhythm of daily operations, a subtle discord in the symphony of personalities and relationships that made S.H.I.E.L.D. function effectively. Conversations felt slightly off-key. Familiar faces seemed somehow unfamiliar despite showing no obvious physical changes, and longtime colleagues occasionally used phrases or references that didn't match their established cultural backgrounds or personal histories. The breakthrough came through an accident of timing and observation that demonstrated how crucial seemingly insignificant details could be in intelligence work. Nick had been reviewing security footage from a routine briefing when he noticed that Agent Johnson, a 15-year S.H.I.E.L.D. veteran with an established reputation for meticulous attention to protocol, had failed to follow a specific procedural step that had become second nature through years of repetition. The deviation was minor, the sort of thing that might happen to anyone having an off day, but it was completely inconsistent with Johnson's established behavioral patterns. The investigation that followed was conducted with the kind of paranoid thoroughness that Nick had learned was essential when dealing with threats that could compromise the very foundations of trust within an organization. Every aspect of Agent Johnson's recent activities was examined, from his mission reports and expense accounts to his personal communications and behavioral observations from colleagues. The picture that emerged was disturbing. A pattern of subtle changes that suggested someone who looked like Johnson and knew all of Johnson's professional information, but lacked the deep personal knowledge and ingrained habits that couldn't be learned from any file or briefing. The confirmation came through a test so simple that its effectiveness was almost embarrassing. Nick arranged for Johnson to encounter a reference to a shared experience from their early days working together, a minor incident that had never been officially reported but had become a private joke between them. The real Johnson would have responded with recognition and probably some good-natured ribbing about Nick's role in the embarrassing situation. Instead, the person wearing Johnson's face showed polite confusion and asked for clarification about an event he should have remembered as clearly as his own name. The realization that one of his trusted agents had been replaced by an alien imposter was terrifying enough, but the implications extended far beyond a single compromised individual. If the Skrulls could replace one S.H.I.E.L.D. agent without detection, how many others had they substituted? How long had this infiltration been ongoing? How much classified information had been compromised? And how many operations had been conducted under alien observation or influence? The questions multiplied exponentially, each one opening new possibilities for catastrophic security breaches. The decision to disappear from official channels wasn't made lightly, but the scope of the potential infiltration made conventional counterintelligence measures not just inadequate but potentially dangerous. If S.H.I.E.L.D. itself had been compromised at multiple levels, then using normal organizational resources to investigate the problem would simply alert the infiltrators to his suspicions and give them opportunities to eliminate him or complete whatever mission they were pursuing. The only safe approach was to assume that everyone and everything connected to official channels had been potentially compromised. Going underground required abandoning the resources and support systems that had defined Nick's professional life for decades, forcing him to rely instead on personal relationships and unofficial networks that existed outside normal intelligence channels. The safe houses he used were properties he had acquired through private means, locations that didn't appear in any official records and weren't known to anyone within the formal command structure. The communication methods were equally unofficial, using techniques and codes that he had developed independently of standard SHIELD protocols. The loneliness of operating without backup or official support was profound, creating a psychological pressure that tested even Nick's considerable mental resilience. The paranoia that had once been a useful professional tool now became a constant companion, making it impossible to trust anyone completely or accept any information without extensive independent verification. Every interaction carried the potential for betrayal. Every piece of intelligence could be disinformation designed to manipulate his responses, and every ally might actually be an enemy wearing a familiar face. The process of building a resistance network from scratch required skills that Nick had developed throughout his career but had never needed to apply on such a scale or under such circumstances. Each potential recruit had to be evaluated, not just for their abilities and loyalty, but for their likelihood of being genuine humans, rather than Skrull replacements. The screening process was necessarily crude and often relied on personal knowledge and shared experiences that couldn't be easily faked, though the sophistication of Skrull impersonation made even these methods uncertain. The few individuals Nick was able to contact and verify as genuine humans shared his sense of isolation and paranoia, creating a small community of resistance fighters who understood that they might be among the last free humans on Earth. Their resources were limited and their methods necessarily improvised, but they possessed something that their alien enemies couldn't fully replicate: the deep, instinctive understanding of human nature and motivation that came from actually being human rather than simply appearing to be. Intelligence gathering became an exercise in detective work that would have challenged even the most experienced investigators, requiring the resistance to piece together the scope and objectives of the Skrull infiltration using only indirect evidence and careful observation. The aliens were clearly working towards some larger goal, but their long-term planning and patient approach made their ultimate intentions difficult to discern. The replacement process appeared to have been ongoing for years, possibly decades, with infiltrators positioned throughout government, military, and civilian leadership. The technology available to the resistance was necessarily limited to equipment that couldn't be tracked or monitored through official channels, forcing them to rely on older, simpler devices and methods that were less efficient but more secure. Communication was conducted through dead drops and coded messages. Surveillance was performed using basic optical equipment, and transportation depended on vehicles and routes that couldn't be easily monitored by compromised agencies. The psychological warfare aspects of the conflict were perhaps more challenging than the practical difficulties of operating without resources or support. The knowledge that trusted friends and colleagues might not be who they appeared to be created a level of suspicion and isolation that was corrosive to morale and mental health. The resistance fighters had to maintain their humanity and their commitment to protecting innocent people while simultaneously suspecting that many of those people might not actually be human at all. The discovery that the infiltration extended beyond SHIELD to include other intelligence agencies, military organizations, and government bodies was both confirming and devastating. The scope of the Skrull operation was larger than Nick had initially feared, suggesting a level of planning and coordination that indicated this was not simply an intelligence-gathering mission, but preparation for something far more significant. The aliens weren't just observing human civilization. They were positioning themselves to control or replace it entirely. The Resistance's limited ability to communicate with other potential human survivors created a sense of operating in complete isolation, never knowing whether their actions were part of a larger resistance movement or simply the futile gestures of a few individuals who had managed to avoid detection. The psychological burden of believing that you might be among the last free humans on Earth was enormous, requiring a level of mental toughness that few people possessed. Evidence began to accumulate, suggesting that the Skrull infiltration was approaching some kind of culmination, with increased activity and coordination among the suspected replacements, indicating that whatever they had been planning was entering its final phase. The urgency of the situation was balanced against the need for careful preparation, as premature action could alert the invaders and eliminate any remaining chance of successful resistance. The development of methods for detecting and exposing Skrull infiltrators became the Resistance's primary technical challenge, requiring creative approaches that didn't rely on advanced technology or laboratory facilities. The aliens' shape-shifting abilities were nearly perfect, but their understanding of human psychology and behavior was necessarily incomplete, creating opportunities for detection by those who knew what to look for and how to ask the right questions. The moral complexities of the situation were staggering, as the Resistance had to operate under the assumption that anyone could be an enemy while still trying to protect innocent humans who might be caught up in the conflict. The decision of who to trust and who to suspect carried life and death consequences, not just for the Resistance fighters, but for potentially millions of people whose lives hung in the balance of actions they would never know about. The coordination with superhuman allies who had managed to avoid replacement presented both opportunities and additional security challenges, as these individuals' extraordinary abilities made them valuable assets, while their high profiles made them likely targets for infiltration attempts. The process of verifying their authenticity required even more sophisticated methods than those used for ordinary humans, given the aliens' demonstrated ability to replicate not just appearance but apparently superhuman abilities as well. The planning for what would eventually become the final confrontation required balancing the need for surprise and coordination against the limitations imposed by compromised communication systems and the constant threat of discovery. Every aspect of the operation had to be planned with the assumption that some of the apparent allies might actually be enemies, while still maintaining enough trust and cooperation to mount an effective resistance. The psychological preparation for a battle that would determine the fate of human civilization was unlike anything Nick had experienced in his long career of facing impossible odds and making life and death decisions. The knowledge that failure would mean not just personal death but the potential extinction of human freedom created a level of pressure that tested even his legendary resilience and determination. As the moment of truth approached, Nick reflected on the journey that had brought him from the battlefields of World War II to this ultimate test of everything he had learned about leadership, courage, and the price of freedom. The skills and knowledge accumulated over decades of military service and intelligence work had prepared him for this moment. But the stakes were higher than anything he had previously faced. The fate of humanity itself rested on the shoulders of a small group of resistance fighters, operating with limited resources against an enemy whose capabilities and intentions were still not fully understood. The transition from years of careful preparation and patient observation to direct action would require everything Nick had learned about timing, strategy, and the crucial importance of trust among people facing impossible odds. The underground phase of the Resistance was coming to an end, and the real battle for Earth's future was about to begin. The concept of legacy had always been an abstract consideration for Nick Fury, until the day he discovered that his bloodline carried forward in ways he had never anticipated or planned. The revelation that he had a son came not through family reunion or careful genealogical research, but through the brutal circumstances of a military operation that threatened to destroy everything both men had worked to protect. Marcus Johnson had been forged in the same crucible of military service and international conflict that had shaped his father, though their paths to that shared understanding had been entirely separate until fate and enemy action brought them together. The first indication that Nick's personal life would intersect with his professional responsibilities in such a dramatic fashion came through intelligence reports about a targeted assassination campaign against individuals connected to his past operations. The attacks weren't random acts of terrorism, but carefully planned strikes against people who had worked with or alongside Nick during various phases of his long career. The precision and insider knowledge required for such operations suggested that someone with access to highly classified information was directing a systematic effort to eliminate witnesses to events that certain parties wanted to remain buried. Marcus Johnson's military record was exemplary in ways that reminded Nick of his own early career, demonstrating the kind of natural leadership ability and tactical intelligence that suggested genetic as well as environmental factors in the development of such capabilities. The younger man had served with distinction in multiple theaters of operation, earning commendations for actions that displayed exactly the combination of courage, improvisation, and concern for his fellow soldiers that had characterized Nick's own service decades earlier. The similarities were too numerous and too specific to be coincidental, though the full truth of their relationship remained hidden until circumstances forced it into the open. The attack that revealed their connection was both precisely targeted and brutally effective, demonstrating the kind of intelligence gathering and operational planning that only the most sophisticated organizations could accomplish. Marcus had been returning from a routine deployment when his transport convoy was ambushed by forces that knew not only his exact route and timing, but also the specific tactical responses that his security detail would likely employ. The precision of the assault suggested inside knowledge that went far beyond what ordinary intelligence gathering could provide. The injuries Marcus sustained during the ambush were severe enough to require immediate medical intervention, but they also served as the catalyst for discoveries that would reshape both men's understanding of their own identities and capabilities. Blood tests conducted during his emergency treatment revealed genetic markers that were unmistakably connected to Nick's own unique biological profile, including traces of the infinity formula that had been part of Nick's system for decades. The medical evidence was incontrovertible. Marcus Johnson was indeed Nick Fury's son, carrying within his DNA the legacy of his father's extraordinary experiences and chemical modifications. The reunion between father and son took place in a military hospital under circumstances that were anything but ideal for such a momentous personal revelation. Nick arrived expecting to interview a witness to an attack that might provide clues about the broader assassination campaign, only to discover that the young soldier fighting for his life was carrying his own genetic legacy into the next generation. The emotional impact of such a discovery, coming at a time when both men were dealing with immediate threats to their survival, created a complex mixture of joy, guilt, and urgent practical concern for their mutual safety. The investigation into Marcus's background revealed a history that paralleled Nick's own journey in remarkable ways, though it had unfolded in a completely different era and under very different circumstances. Marcus had grown up never knowing his father's identity, raised by a mother who had chosen to protect both her son and herself by maintaining complete secrecy about his paternity. The decision had undoubtedly saved both their lives, as Nick's enemies would certainly have used any known family connections as leverage or targets for retaliation throughout his long and dangerous career. The woman who had been Marcus's mother represented a chapter in Nick's life that he had deliberately closed and buried, not out of callousness, but from the practical necessity of protecting those he cared about from the dangers that constantly surrounded anyone connected to his work. The brief relationship that had produced Marcus had occurred during one of the rare peaceful interludes in Nick's career, a moment when the possibility of normal human connection had seemed achievable before the demands of duty and the realities of his situation had made such connections too dangerous to maintain. The genetic inheritance that Marcus had received went far beyond simple physical resemblance or personality traits, extending to include physiological modifications that were the direct result of Nick's exposure to the infinity formula decades earlier. The chemical compound that had extended Nick's life and enhanced his physical capabilities had apparently created permanent changes to his genetic structure that could be passed on to his offspring. Marcus possessed enhanced healing abilities, improved physical conditioning, and a resistance to aging that would make him valuable to the same kinds of organizations that had shaped his father's career. The training that Marcus received once his true heritage was revealed drew upon everything Nick had learned about developing exceptional soldiers and intelligence operatives, but it also incorporated advances in technology and technique that hadn't been available during Nick's own development. The younger man's military experience provided an excellent foundation, but the scope of threats and responsibilities he would face required additional skills and knowledge that could only be gained through intensive, specialized instruction. The relationship between father and son evolved gradually from the initial shock of discovery through the practical necessities of survival and training to something resembling the normal bonds of family affection. The process was complicated by the fact that both men were products of military cultures that emphasized duty over personal relationships, and by the immediate dangers that made emotional vulnerability a potential liability. The luxury of normal family bonding would have to wait until they had dealt with the immediate threats to their survival and mission effectiveness. The enemies who had targeted Marcus as part of their campaign against Nick's associates quickly realized that they had underestimated both the resources available to their primary target and the capabilities of his newly discovered son. The attacks that followed were more sophisticated and more dangerous than the initial ambush, involving enemy agents with advanced training and equipment who understood that they were no longer dealing with isolated targets, but with a coordinated response from individuals with exceptional abilities and extensive support networks. The transition of responsibilities from father to son was handled with the same careful attention to operational security and strategic planning that had characterized all of Nick's major decisions throughout his career. The process wasn't simply a matter of passing on accumulated knowledge and resources, but of ensuring that Marcus could operate effectively within systems and organizations that had been shaped by decades of Nick's leadership and influence. The younger man needed to establish his own credibility and relationships while also benefiting from his father's reputation and connections. The formation of the Secret Avengers represented a new approach to the kinds of covert operations that had been Nick's specialty throughout his career, but adapted for contemporary threats and utilizing team members whose capabilities were far beyond what traditional intelligence operatives could accomplish. Marcus's role in this organization reflected both his inheritance of his father's strategic thinking and his own unique perspectives shaped by modern military experience and different generational approaches to leadership and cooperation. The Ultimate Universe version of Nick Fury represented an entirely different evolutionary path for the character, one that reflected changing cultural attitudes and demographic realities while maintaining the essential characteristics that made the original version compelling. This alternate version was created as part of Marvel's effort to modernize classic characters for contemporary audiences, incorporating visual and cultural elements that would resonate with readers who might not connect with the traditional portrayal. The decision to model the Ultimate Universe Nick Fury on Samuel L. Jackson was initially made without the actor's permission or involvement, representing a bold creative choice that could have created legal complications if not handled carefully. The visual resemblance was so striking and deliberate that it was clearly intended as more than simple coincidence, suggesting that the creators had specific ideas about how this version of the character should look and behave in ways that differed from the original. The backstory and character development for Ultimate Nick Fury incorporated elements that reflected contemporary understanding of military service, intelligence operations, and international relations, while maintaining connections to the historical events and personal experiences that had shaped the original version. The result was a character who felt both familiar and fresh, honoring the legacy of the classic version while offering new possibilities for storytelling and character development. The integration of Ultimate Nick Fury into the broader Marvel Cinematic Universe represented a successful example of how comic book concepts could be adapted for different media while maintaining their essential appeal and functionality. Samuel L. Jackson's portrayal brought gravitas, charisma, and authenticity to the role, creating a version of the character that worked effectively in both standalone appearances and as part of ensemble pieces. The themes of legacy and continuity that ran through all versions of Nick Fury's story reflected broader questions about how individual actions and choices could influence events across multiple generations and different versions of reality. The character's longevity and adaptability demonstrated the enduring appeal of certain archetypal figures, while also showing how those archetypes could evolve to remain relevant in changing cultural contexts. The relationship between different versions of Nick Fury and their respective universes illustrated how the same essential character could be expressed in various ways, while maintaining core characteristics that made them recognizable, compelling. The original's emphasis on military tradition and Cold War espionage, the mainstream Marvel version's focus on superhuman affairs and global security, and the Ultimate version's contemporary military background all represented different facets of the same fundamental concept. The passing of the torch from one generation to the next, whether through biological inheritance or creative reinterpretation, ensured that Nick Fury's influence would continue to be felt long after any individual version of the character had completed his story arc. The values, methods, and perspectives that defined the character could be transmitted and adapted without losing their essential meaning or effectiveness. As the various threads of legacy and succession wove together across different universes and generations, they created a tapestry of interconnected stories that demonstrated how individual choices and actions could have consequences that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. Nick Fury's legacy lived on not just in his biological descendants, but in the institutions he had shaped, the methods he had developed, and the values he had embodied throughout his extraordinary career, spanning multiple lifetimes and realities. The Infinity Formula had been both blessing and curse throughout Nick Fury's extraordinarily long life, a chemical compound that had granted him decades of extended youth, while simultaneously burdening him with the terrible weight of watching everyone he had ever cared about age and die, while he remained essentially unchanged. The substance that Professor Sternberg had introduced into his bloodstream during that desperate moment in a French field hospital had seemed like a miracle at the time, offering healing and recovery when death had seemed inevitable. But as the years accumulated and became decades, and the decades threatened to become centuries, Nick began to understand that some gifts came with prices that could never be fully calculated in advance. The initial effects of the formula had been remarkable and undeniably beneficial, accelerating his recovery from the grenade blast that had cost him his eye, while simultaneously strengthening his physical capabilities in ways that made him more effective as both a soldier and later as an intelligence operative. His reflexes became faster, his endurance greater, and his resistance to injury and disease far beyond normal human parameters. Most importantly for his career, the formula seemed to halt the aging process almost entirely, allowing him to maintain peak physical condition long after his contemporaries had begun to show the inevitable effects of advancing years. But the true implications of his enhanced longevity didn't become apparent until he had outlived his first generation of friends and colleagues, watching helplessly as the men who had served alongside him in the Howling Commandos succumbed one by one to the natural processes of aging and disease that no longer seemed to affect him. The funeral services became a recurring ritual that marked the passage of time in ways that his own unchanged appearance could not. Each ceremony, a reminder that his extended life was purchased at the cost of endless goodbyes and perpetual solitude. The psychological impact of near immortality was something that no amount of military training or intelligence experience could have prepared him for, creating challenges that went far beyond the practical difficulties of maintaining cover identities across multiple decades. The accumulation of memories, relationships, and losses created a weight of experience that ordinary humans never had to bear, while the knowledge that he would likely outlive anyone he allowed himself to care about made genuine emotional connections increasingly difficult to maintain. The loneliness was perhaps the most unexpected and devastating aspect of his extended lifespan, though it was a price that revealed itself gradually rather than all at once. In the early years, when the formula's effects were still new and the full extent of his longevity wasn't yet apparent, Nick had assumed that he would eventually age and die like everyone else, just more slowly than normal. The realization that his lifespan might be measured in centuries rather than decades came as a shock that fundamentally altered his perspective on relationships, career planning, and the basic assumptions that guided normal human behavior. The practical challenges of living far beyond normal human parameters were numerous and complex, requiring constant attention to details that ordinary people never had to consider. Maintaining consistent identity documents across multiple decades required either sophisticated forgery or cooperation from government agencies that understood his unique situation. Explaining his unchanging appearance to new acquaintances and colleagues required carefully crafted cover stories that could withstand casual scrutiny without raising suspicions that might compromise his operational effectiveness. The emotional toll of watching civilizations change and evolve while remaining essentially static himself was something that Nick had never anticipated when he first accepted the benefits that the Infinity Formula provided. The world of the 1940s, with its clear moral divisions and straightforward conflicts, had gradually given way to the complex ambiguities of the Cold War, which had in turn evolved into the even more complicated landscape of modern international relations. Through all these changes, Nick remained a constant figure, adapting his methods and objectives while maintaining the fundamental perspectives that had been shaped by his earliest experiences. The relationships that sustained him through the decades of extended life were necessarily different from those that ordinary humans could maintain, requiring acceptance of the fact that he would eventually outlive everyone he allowed himself to care about. Romantic relationships became particularly complicated, as the normal progression from courtship through marriage to old age together was impossible when one partner remained essentially unchanged, while the other aged according to natural processes. The choice to avoid deep emotional attachments was both practical and heartbreaking, protecting him from the pain of loss, while also denying him the connections that made extended life meaningful. Professional relationships were somewhat easier to manage, as they were based on shared objectives and mutual respect, rather than deep emotional bonds. But even these connections carried their own forms of grief as colleagues retired, died, or simply moved on to other pursuits, while Nick continued in roles that required his unique combination of experience and physical capability. The institutional memory that he represented became increasingly valuable as the decades passed, but it also made him a repository of secrets and knowledge that few others could understand or appreciate. The decision to continue taking the infinity formula required periodic re-evaluation as Nick weighed the benefits of extended life against the costs of perpetual solitude and emotional isolation. There were periods when the burden of near immortality seemed too great to bear, when the accumulated weight of losses and the prospect of endless future goodbyes made the idea of natural aging and death seem like a release rather than a defeat. But the responsibilities he carried and the knowledge that his continued existence served larger purposes always eventually convinced him to maintain the chemical regimen that kept him functionally immortal. The scientific understanding of how the formula worked evolved significantly over the decades as advances in biochemistry and genetics provided new insights into the mechanisms that had granted Nick his extended lifespan. The compound appeared to affect cellular regeneration and DNA repair processes in ways that prevented the normal accumulation of damage that caused aging, while also enhancing the body's natural healing and recovery capabilities. The effects were so profound and so well integrated into his biological systems that removing them would have been extremely difficult and potentially fatal. The limited supply of the formula became an increasingly significant concern as the decades passed and the original source was depleted through regular use. Professor Sternberg's research notes provided some guidance for synthesis, but the complex biochemical processes involved were difficult to replicate without access to the original materials and equipment. The possibility that Nick might eventually run out of the compound that sustained his extended life added urgency to his efforts to accomplish his goals, while he still had the time and capability to do so. The relationships with other individuals who possessed extended lifespans, whether through similar chemical interventions, mutant abilities, or other supernatural means, provided some relief from the isolation that characterized much of Nick's existence. These connections, while rare, offered opportunities to interact with others who understood the unique challenges and perspectives that came with living far beyond normal human parameters. However, even these relationships were complicated by the different sources and characteristics of their respective longevity, creating disparities in experience and outlook that could be as isolating as they were comforting. The accumulation of knowledge and experience across multiple decades of active service in military and intelligence operations made Nick an invaluable resource for understanding historical patterns and long-term strategic trends that escaped the notice of shorter-lived analysts and decision-makers. His personal memory of events that others knew only from historical records provided unique insights into the motivations and methods of long-term adversaries, while his direct experience with technological and social changes allowed him to anticipate developments that others might miss. The burden of carrying so many secrets and classified information across such extended periods created psychological pressures that ordinary intelligence officers never had to face, as the normal processes of retirement and civilian life that allowed others to leave their professional concerns behind were not available to someone whose career spanned multiple generations. The compartmentalization required to function effectively while carrying decades of sensitive information required mental discipline that few people could maintain over such extended periods. The decision to finally stop taking the infinity formula was one of the most difficult and significant choices Nick had made in his extraordinarily long life, representing not just acceptance of mortality, but a fundamental shift in how he understood his role and responsibilities. The choice was motivated partly by the dwindling supply of the compound, and partly by a growing sense that his extended lifespan had served its purpose. and that it was time to allow natural processes to resume their course. The final doses of the formula were reserved not for his own continued survival, but for emergency situations where they might save the lives of others who were critical to ongoing operations, or whose deaths would represent unacceptable losses to the causes he had served throughout his career. The decision to use the last of his life-extending medication to save Bucky Barnes represented both a practical calculation about operational needs and a symbolic passing of responsibility to someone who could continue the work that Nick had devoted his life to accomplishing. The process of aging that began once Nick stopped taking the Infinity Formula was rapid and dramatic, as if decades of accumulated time were suddenly catching up with biological processes that had been held in suspended animation. The physical changes were profound and sometimes painful, but they were also accompanied by a sense of relief and completion that surprised him with its intensity. For the first time in decades, he was aging at the same rate as the people around him, sharing their mortality and their perspective on the finite nature of human existence. The knowledge that his remaining time was now measured in years rather than decades brought both urgency and peace to Nick's final period of active service, allowing him to focus on completing the most important aspects of his life's work, while also accepting that some tasks would need to be left to others. The transition from immortal guardian to mortal mentor required adjustments in planning and perspective that were both challenging and liberating, as he learned to work within the constraints of normal human lifespan while still pursuing objectives that required long-term commitment and sustained effort. The legacy of the Infinity Formula extended beyond Nick's own extended lifespan to influence the development of other longevity treatments and enhancement procedures that would benefit future generations of soldiers and operatives. The scientific knowledge gained from studying his unique biochemistry contributed to advances in medical research that had applications far beyond military and intelligence operations, potentially helping ordinary people live longer, healthier lives while maintaining their physical and mental capabilities well into advanced age. As Nick faced the prospect of natural death for the first time in decades, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that the Infinity Formula had made possible, weighing the costs and benefits of his extended existence against the alternatives that might have unfolded if he had aged and died according to normal human patterns. The experiences, relationships, and accomplishments that had filled those extra decades were irreplaceable, but so were the losses and sacrifices that had been required to make such extended service possible. The transformation from Nick Fury, director of S.H.I.E.L.D., to the entity known as the Unseen, represented perhaps the most profound metamorphosis in a life already marked by extraordinary changes and adaptations. The events that led to this final evolution began with revelations so shocking and comprehensive that they threatened to unravel not just Nick's understanding of his own history, but the very foundations of trust and reality upon which the entire superhero community had been built. The original Sin storyline would expose secrets that had been buried for decades, forcing confrontations with truths so disturbing that they would fundamentally alter the relationships between Earth's mightiest heroes and the man who had guided and protected them for so long. The investigation that would ultimately lead to Nick's transformation began with the murder of Uatu the Watcher, one of the most powerful and enigmatic beings in the universe, whose death sent shockwaves through cosmic circles that few mortals could even comprehend. The Watcher's role as a passive observer of universal events had made him privy to secrets and knowledge that spanned galaxies and eons, but his strict adherence to non-interference had supposedly kept that information safely contained. His assassination suggested that someone was willing to go to unprecedented lengths to obtain or silence the cosmic secrets he possessed. The discovery that Nick Fury was somehow connected to the Watcher's death came as a devastating blow to the superhero community that had trusted and relied on his guidance for decades. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, revealing a pattern of covert activities and morally questionable decisions that painted a very different picture of the man they thought they knew. The Nick Fury they had worked with and fought alongside was revealed to have been conducting operations so secret and so ethically compromising that even his closest allies had been kept completely in the dark about their existence. The web of deception that unraveled during the investigation revealed decades of covert missions that Nick had undertaken without official sanction or oversight, using resources and methods that pushed far beyond the boundaries of acceptable intelligence operations. These weren't simply classified missions that required compartmentalization for operational security, but activities that violated fundamental principles about the limits of power and the rights of both allies and enemies. The scope of Nick's unauthorized operations was staggering, involving manipulations and interventions that had shaped major historical events without the knowledge or consent of the people affected. The revelation that Nick had been secretly eliminating threats to Earth for decades, often through methods that his official allies would never have approved, forced a complete re-evaluation of his character and motivations. The targets of these covert operations weren't necessarily evil in any conventional sense, but individuals or entities that Nick had determined posed unacceptable risks to planetary security based on his own judgment and analysis. The unilateral nature of these decisions represented a level of assumed authority that was both breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications. The most shocking revelation was that Nick had been conducting these operations with the knowledge and assistance of Watu the Watcher, creating a secret partnership that violated the Watcher's fundamental oath of non-interference while providing Nick with cosmic-level intelligence and capabilities. This alliance had enabled operations that would have been impossible through conventional means, allowing Nick to identify and neutralize threats before they could fully manifest while maintaining complete secrecy about his methods and motivations. The moral complexity of Nick's hidden activities created impossible ethical dilemmas for the heroes who discovered them, forcing them to confront questions about the nature of heroism, the limits of acceptable action, and the price of protecting innocent lives. Many of the threats that Nick had eliminated in secret might indeed have posed catastrophic dangers to Earth, but the unilateral nature of his decisions and the deceptive methods he had employed raised fundamental questions about accountability and the concentration of power in the hands of individuals who operated beyond any form of oversight or consent. The investigation revealed that some of Earth's greatest victories and narrow escapes from disaster had been facilitated by Nick's covert interventions, creating a paradox where actions that had saved millions of lives were simultaneously violations of the principles and values that those lives were supposed to represent. The heroes found themselves in the impossible position of condemning methods that had protected them while benefiting from results they couldn't ethically endorse. The confrontation between Nick and the assembled heroes was one of the most emotionally devastating moments in the history of their relationships, as decades of trust and cooperation crumbled under the weight of revelations that recontextualized every interaction and collaboration they had shared. The Nick Fury they thought they knew was revealed to be a carefully constructed persona designed to maintain their cooperation while concealing activities that would have horrified them if they had known about them at the time. Nick's defense of his actions was both compelling and troubling, as he argued that the threats he had faced and the decisions he had been forced to make existed in a moral universe that was far more complex and dangerous than his allies had ever realized. His perspective, shaped by decades of confronting cosmic-level threats and impossible choices, had evolved to a point where conventional ethical frameworks seemed inadequate to address the realities of protecting an entire planet from forces that most people couldn't even imagine. The weight of carrying such enormous secrets and responsibilities for so many decades had fundamentally changed Nick in ways that even his closest associates had failed to recognize, creating a level of isolation and moral burden that had gradually separated him from normal human concerns and relationships. The man who had begun his career as a straightforward soldier fighting clear enemies had been transformed by experience and necessity into something much more complex and morally ambiguous. The revelation that Nick's actions had been motivated not by personal ambition or corruption, but by a genuine commitment to protecting Earth, made the situation even more ethically complicated, as it was difficult to argue with the results of his interventions, while simultaneously condemning the methods he had employed to achieve them. The saved lives and prevented catastrophes were real and significant, but so were the violated principles and betrayed trusts that had made those victories possible. The cosmic forces that had been disturbed by the Watcher's death and the exposure of Nick's secret activities demanded resolution and punishment on a scale that transcended human justice systems, creating a situation where the consequences of his actions would be determined by entities and principles that operated according to cosmic rather than terrestrial law. The punishment that awaited Nick was both appropriate to the scope of his actions and terrible in its implications for his continued existence. The transformation of Nick Fury into the unseen was accomplished through cosmic forces that operated beyond human understanding or control, stripping away his identity, his relationships, and his ability to interact normally with the world he had devoted his life to protecting. The punishment was both exile and assignment, removing him from human society while simultaneously binding him to an eternal vigil that would continue his protective role in a completely different form. The role of the unseen required Nick to observe and monitor threats to Earth while being unable to directly intervene or communicate with the people he was protecting, creating a form of isolation that was more complete and permanent than anything he had experienced during his extended mortal lifetime. The cosmic awareness that came with his new existence provided him with knowledge of dangers and opportunities that he could no longer act upon directly, forcing him to find subtle ways to influence events while respecting the cosmic restrictions that governed his transformed state. The psychological impact of becoming the unseen was profound and multifaceted, as Nick had to adapt to existence as a being who was simultaneously more and less than human, possessing cosmic awareness while being cut off from the human connections and relationships that had given his long life meaning and purpose. The transformation was both punishment and apotheosis, elevating him to a level of cosmic significance, while stripping away the personal agency and interpersonal relationships that had defined his identity. The irony of his situation was not lost on Nick, as his transformation into a cosmic guardian represented the ultimate expression of the protective instincts and sacrificial dedication that had characterized his entire career, while simultaneously punishing him for the methods he had employed in service of those same noble goals. The unseen was both the fulfillment of his life's mission, and the price he paid for pursuing that mission through means that violated cosmic law and moral principles. The loneliness of his new existence was absolute and permanent, as the cosmic restrictions that governed the unseen prevented him from forming the kind of relationships and connections that had sustained him through his extended mortal life. The isolation was more complete than anything he had experienced during his decades of covert operations, as he could observe but not participate in the ongoing struggles and triumphs of the people he continued to protect from his cosmic vantage point. The knowledge that came with his transformation provided Nick with unprecedented awareness of threats and opportunities affecting Earth and the broader universe, but the restrictions on his ability to act on that knowledge created a form of frustration and helplessness that was uniquely torturous for someone whose entire identity had been built around taking decisive action to protect others. The cosmic perspective he had gained revealed the interconnectedness and complexity of universal forces in ways that made his previous understanding seem limited and naive. The eternal nature of his vigil meant that Nick would continue his protective role long after all the people he had known and worked with during his mortal existence had aged and died, watching over generations of humans who would never know his name or understand the sacrifices he had made on their behalf. The continuity of his mission provided purpose and meaning to his transformed existence, but it also emphasized the permanent nature of his separation from normal human experience. As the unseen, Nick Fury had become something both more and less than the man he had been, elevated to cosmic significance while being stripped of the human agency and relationships that had made his long life meaningful. The transformation represented the ultimate expression of his commitment to protecting Earth, while simultaneously serving as punishment for the methods he had employed in pursuit of that goal, creating a form of existence that was both fulfillment and exile, purpose and isolation, wisdom and helplessness, combined in ways that only cosmic justice could devise. The relationships that defined Nick Fury's extraordinary life were as complex and layered as the man himself, shaped by the unique circumstances of his extended lifespan and the demands of a career that required him to balance genuine human connection with the necessities of operational security. Throughout his decades of service, Nick had been forced to navigate the delicate territory between professional necessity and personal need, creating bonds that were simultaneously deeper and more constrained than those experienced by ordinary people living conventional lives. The romantic relationships that punctuated Nick's long existence were inevitably complicated by the realities of his work and the burden of his extended lifespan, creating situations where genuine affection had to compete with the practical impossibilities of maintaining normal partnerships under such extraordinary circumstances. The women who entered his life were often remarkable individuals in their own right, drawn to his strength and competence, while sometimes unaware of the full scope of the dangers and responsibilities that defined his existence. The relationships that developed were intense and meaningful, but they were also necessarily limited by the knowledge that Nick would likely outlive any partner while remaining essentially unchanged by the passage of time. The affair that had produced Marcus Johnson represented one of the few times in Nick's life when he had allowed himself to believe that normal human connection might be possible, creating a brief period of hope and vulnerability that was ultimately ended by the practical realities of his situation. The woman who had carried his son had been remarkable in her strength and understanding, recognizing that their relationship could not continue without endangering both her and their unborn child. Her decision to raise Marcus without revealing his father's identity had been both heartbreaking and wise, protecting both mother and son from enemies who would not have hesitated to use such connections as leverage or targets for revenge. The friendships that sustained Nick through his long career were built on shared experiences and mutual respect, rather than the kind of casual social interaction that characterized most human relationships, creating bonds that were both deeper and more professionally focused than ordinary friendships. The men and women who earned his trust were typically individuals who had proven themselves under extreme circumstances, demonstrating the kind of courage, competence, and integrity that Nick valued above all other qualities. These relationships were precious to him precisely because they were so rare, representing connections with people who understood the weight of responsibility and the price of service. The relationship with the members of the Howling Commandos had set the pattern for many of Nick's subsequent friendships, establishing his preference for bonds forged in combat and tested through shared hardship. The camaraderie that had developed among those men during World War II had been based on absolute trust and mutual dependence, creating a template for friendship that Nick would seek to recreate throughout his career. The gradual loss of these original companions as they aged and died while he remained essentially unchanged had been one of the most painful aspects of his extended existence, teaching him lessons about the cost of immortality that no amount of preparation could have made easier to bear. The professional relationships that Nick maintained with various superheroes and government officials required a different kind of diplomatic skill, as he had to balance his genuine respect and affection for these individuals with the practical necessities of maintaining operational security and institutional effectiveness. The heroes he worked with were often idealistic in ways that reminded him of his own younger self, but their principles sometimes conflicted with the harsh realities of intelligence work and international security. Nick's ability to maintain their trust and cooperation, while keeping them from learning about the more morally ambiguous aspects of his operations, required constant attention to the delicate balance between honesty and necessary deception. The mentorship role that Nick increasingly assumed as his career progressed allowed him to channel his accumulated knowledge and experience into the development of younger agents and heroes who would carry on his work after his eventual departure. These relationships were particularly meaningful to him because they represented a form of legacy that went beyond individual accomplishments or organizational achievements, creating a continuity of values and methods that would influence future generations of protectors and defenders. The satisfaction he derived from watching his protégés grow and develop their own capabilities was one of the few unambiguous rewards of his long and often lonely career. The relationship with Tony Stark exemplified many of the challenges and rewards that characterized Nick's interactions with the superhero community, combining genuine mutual respect with the practical difficulties of managing someone whose intelligence and resources rivaled those of most governments. Stark's brilliant mind and technological capabilities made him an invaluable ally, but his independent nature and sometimes reckless decision-making created ongoing concerns about operational security and strategic coordination. The friendship that developed between them was based on shared commitment to protecting innocent people, but it was also complicated by their different approaches to achieving that goal. The dynamic with Steve Rogers represented another facet of Nick's complex relationships with the heroes he worked alongside, as Captain America's unwavering moral principles sometimes conflicted with the pragmatic necessities that guided Nick's decision-making. Rogers' integrity and dedication were qualities that Nick deeply respected and admired, but the Captain's idealistic approach to heroism sometimes created operational difficulties when situations required morally ambiguous solutions. The mutual respect between them was genuine and lasting, but it was also tempered by an underlying tension between different philosophical approaches to protecting the innocent. The bonds formed with other veterans of military service created a different category of relationship that was based on shared understanding of combat experience and the unique psychological pressures that came with taking lives in service of larger causes. These connections transcended differences in rank, nationality, or political affiliation, creating a brotherhood of arms that provided Nick with some of his most reliable and enduring friendships. The common language of military experience allowed for communication and understanding that didn't require extensive explanation or justification, making these relationships particularly valuable during periods when the weight of his responsibilities felt overwhelming. The family relationships that Nick had been forced to maintain at a distance were perhaps the most painful aspect of his personal life, as the dangers inherent in his work made it impossible to maintain normal connections with relatives who might become targets for enemies seeking leverage or revenge. The discovery that he had a son had forced him to confront the reality that his commitment to protecting others had required him to sacrifice the kind of family bonds that most people took for granted. The relationship with Marcus Johnson that developed after the revelation of their connection was both a source of joy and a reminder of all the years of fatherhood that had been lost to operational necessity. The leadership philosophy that Nick developed over decades of command experience emphasized personal responsibility, decisive action, and the willingness to make difficult choices that others might not be able to live with. His approach to managing both individual agents and large organizations was based on clear communication of objectives and expectations, combined with the flexibility to adapt methods and tactics as circumstances required. The trust that he inspired in his subordinates was based not on charismatic personality, but on demonstrated competence and unwavering commitment to their welfare and mission success. The management style that Nick employed with S.H.I.E.L.D. reflected his understanding that effective leadership required balancing the need for operational security with the importance of maintaining morale and institutional loyalty. The compartmentalization that was necessary to protect sensitive operations had to be implemented in ways that didn't undermine the sense of shared purpose and mutual trust that made the organization function effectively. Nick's ability to maintain this balance was one of his most valuable skills as a leader, allowing him to preserve operational security while still inspiring dedication and excellence from his personnel. The moral philosophy that guided Nick's decision-making throughout his career was based on utilitarian principles that prioritized the greatest good for the greatest number of people, even when that required individual sacrifices or morally questionable methods. His willingness to bear the psychological burden of making such choices allowed others to maintain their idealism and moral clarity while still benefiting from the protection that his pragmatic approach provided. The isolation that this philosophy required was one of the prices he paid for his effectiveness, as few people could understand or accept the reasoning that justified his most controversial decisions. The influence that Nick exerted on the development of intelligence and security organizations around the world was subtle but profound, as his methods and approaches were studied and adapted by agencies and institutions that might never acknowledge their debt to his innovations. The training programs he developed, the operational procedures he established, and the ethical frameworks he created for dealing with extraordinary threats became part of the institutional knowledge that shaped how governments and organizations approached the complex challenges of modern security work. The legacy that Nick left in the lives of individual agents and heroes who had worked under his guidance was perhaps more significant than his institutional contributions, as these relationships had shaped the character and capabilities of people who would continue his work long after his own active career had ended. The values he had modeled and the standards he had maintained created ripple effects that influenced decision-making and behavior patterns across multiple generations of protectors and defenders, ensuring that his impact would continue to be felt even after his transformation into the unseen had removed him from direct participation in human affairs. The understanding of human nature that Nick had developed through decades of reading people, managing complex personalities, and predicting behavior under stress was one of his most valuable assets as both a leader and an operative. His ability to assess character, identify motivations, and anticipate reactions allowed him to build effective teams, neutralize threats, and navigate the complex web of relationships that characterized modern international affairs. This psychological insight was based not just on academic study, but on extensive practical experience with people from every level of society and every corner of the globe. The loneliness that was the inevitable consequence of Nick's unique position and responsibilities was something he had learned to manage rather than overcome, accepting it as the price of the kind of life he had chosen to live in service of others. The isolation was both professional necessity and personal reality, as the secrets he carried and the decisions he made created barriers between himself and even his closest allies that could never be completely overcome. The strength required to maintain effectiveness while bearing such psychological burdens was one of his most remarkable characteristics, demonstrating a form of courage that was different from, but no less significant than, physical bravery in combat. The wisdom that Nick had accumulated through his extraordinary experiences was hard-won and often painful, based on lessons learned through failure and loss as much as through success and victory. His understanding of the complexities of human motivation, the unintended consequences of well-intentioned actions, and the difficulty of achieving lasting peace in a dangerous world had been purchased through decades of making impossible choices and living with their consequences. This knowledge made him invaluable as both a strategist and a counselor, though it also created a perspective on human affairs that could be both illuminating and deeply pessimistic. As Nick reflected on the relationships that had defined his long life, he could see how each connection had shaped him in different ways, while also being shaped by the unique circumstances and extraordinary responsibilities that had made normal human bonds so difficult to maintain. The love, friendship, mentorship, and professional respect that he had both given and received had created a web of influence and obligation that extended far beyond his individual existence, ensuring that his impact on the world would continue long after his transformation into the unseen had ended his direct participation in human affairs. The man behind the legend had been forged through relationships that were as complex and meaningful as they were constrained by the demands of duty and the realities of extended existence in service to others. The journey through the shadows and into the light had taken Nick Fury from the rough streets of Hell's Kitchen to the cosmic heights of universal guardianship, but the transformation from mortal man to eternal sentinel represented only the final chapter in a story that had been unfolding since that first moment when a young soldier had chosen duty over safety. As the unseen, Nick found himself in the unique position of being able to reflect not just on his own extraordinary life, but on the broader patterns of heroism, sacrifice, and service that had characterized the age of wonders he had helped to shepherd into existence. The view from his cosmic vantage point provided perspective on the interconnected nature of all the struggles and victories that had marked his long career, revealing how individual acts of courage and dedication had combined to create something greater than the sum of their parts. The heroes he had worked alongside, guided, and sometimes manipulated had each contributed threads to a tapestry of protection and hope that extended far beyond what any single individual could have accomplished alone. The web of relationships and influences that had grown from his initial military service had created ripple effects that would continue to shape events long after his direct participation had ended. The isolation of his new existence was both absolute and strangely liberating, freeing him from the constant pressures of decision-making and responsibility, while simultaneously providing him with an overview of global and cosmic affairs that no mortal perspective could match. The knowledge that came with his transformation revealed the true scope of the threats and challenges that faced not just Earth but the entire universe, placing his own struggles and sacrifices in context, while also demonstrating the ongoing need for the kind of vigilance and protection that had defined his entire career. The heroes who had inherited his mission and methods were proving themselves worthy successors, adapting his lessons to new challenges, while developing their own approaches to the complex problems of protecting innocent people in an increasingly dangerous universe. The satisfaction that Nick derived from observing their growth and success was one of the few emotional rewards available to him in his transformed state, providing evidence that his life's work would continue even in his absence from active participation. The enemies he had faced throughout his career were being confronted by new generations of protectors who brought fresh perspectives and capabilities to conflicts that had sometimes seemed intractable during his mortal lifetime. The patterns of threat and response that he had helped establish were evolving and adapting to meet challenges that he could never have anticipated, demonstrating the resilience and adaptability of the systems and institutions he had helped create. The moral complexities that had characterized so many of his decisions were being wrestled with by heroes who brought their own ethical frameworks and philosophical approaches to questions that had no easy answers. The burden of making impossible choices was being shared among multiple individuals and organizations, rather than concentrated in the hands of a single person, creating a more distributed but also more sustainable approach to the kinds of dilemmas that had once threatened to overwhelm even his considerable capabilities. The technological innovations that had been developed during his tenure as SHIELD director were being refined and improved by scientists and engineers who built upon his foundation while pursuing directions that his own limited imagination had never conceived. The helicarrier, the life model decoys, and the countless other devices and systems that had been part of his operational toolkit were evolving into new forms that maintained their essential functions, while incorporating advances that made them more effective and more ethically acceptable. The intelligence networks and information gathering systems that he had established were continuing to function and grow, providing the kind of early warning and strategic awareness that were essential for preventing catastrophic threats from developing into existential crises. The methods and protocols he had developed for managing sensitive information and coordinating responses to complex threats were being adapted and refined by agencies and organizations around the world, ensuring that his strategic insights would continue to influence global security efforts. The training programs and educational initiatives that had been part of his legacy were producing new generations of agents, analysts, and leaders who understood both the importance of their missions and the ethical constraints that should guide their actions. The balance between effectiveness and accountability that had been such a crucial aspect of his own development was being passed on to others who would face similar challenges while bringing their own perspectives and innovations to the crucial work. The relationships he had built with allied organizations and foreign intelligence services were continuing to provide frameworks for cooperation and coordination that transcended national boundaries and political differences. The trust and mutual respect that he had cultivated over decades of careful diplomacy and proven reliability were assets that continued to benefit international security efforts, even in his absence from active participation. The understanding of superhuman affairs and extraordinary threats that he had developed was being institutionalized through agencies and protocols that could function effectively, even when dealing with phenomena that exceeded normal human comprehension or capability. The frameworks he had established for managing relationships with individuals possessing extraordinary abilities were proving flexible enough to accommodate new types of powers and new forms of heroism that emerged as the universe continued to evolve. The philosophical questions that had shaped his approach to leadership and decision-making were being explored and debated by ethicists, strategists, and philosophers who brought academic rigor to issues that he had been forced to resolve through intuition and practical experience. The intellectual foundations that he had laid through his actions and choices were being examined and refined by minds that could approach these problems with the luxury of theoretical analysis rather than the pressure of immediate, practical necessity. The influence he had exerted on popular culture and public understanding of heroism was continuing to shape how society viewed the relationship between individual capability and collective responsibility. The example he had set through his long career of service had become part of the cultural narrative about what it meant to dedicate one's life to protecting others, inspiring new generations of people to seek careers in public service and defense. The scientific advances that had been made possible through his support of research and development were continuing to yield benefits that extended far beyond their original military and intelligence applications. The medical technologies, communication systems, and analytical tools that had been developed for shield operations were finding civilian applications that improved life for ordinary people, while also enhancing society's ability to respond to natural disasters and other emergencies. The international institutions and cooperative agreements that he had helped negotiate and implement were providing stable frameworks for addressing global challenges that required coordinated responses from multiple nations and organizations. The diplomatic groundwork he had laid was supporting ongoing efforts to manage conflicts, prevent wars, and address transnational threats that no single country could handle effectively on its own. The younger generation of heroes and agents who had learned from his example were beginning to face their own moments of moral complexity and impossible choice, drawing upon the lessons he had taught, while also developing their own approaches to the dilemmas that came with great power and great responsibility. The wisdom he had accumulated through decades of difficult experience was being filtered through new perspectives and applied to new situations that tested whether his insights could transcend the specific circumstances in which they had been developed. The cosmic threats that had begun to emerge during his later career were being addressed by individuals and organizations that understood the scope and scale of such challenges because of the groundwork he had laid in expanding human awareness beyond purely terrestrial concerns. The infrastructure he had created for monitoring and responding to extraordinary threats was proving essential as humanity encountered dangers that required capabilities and perspectives that had never been needed before. The legacy of secrets and hidden knowledge that he had accumulated was being managed by successors who understood both the importance of such information and the dangers of allowing it to be misused or fall into the wrong hands. The systems he had established for protecting sensitive intelligence, while still allowing it to be used effectively, were being tested and refined by people who shared his commitment to using knowledge responsibly. As the unseen, Nick Fury could see how the threads of influence and inspiration that had grown from his long career were weaving themselves into the fabric of a future that would be shaped by the choices and actions of heroes he had helped train and inspire. The isolation of his transformed existence was balanced by the satisfaction of knowing that his life's work would continue through the efforts of people who understood the importance of the mission he had devoted himself to pursuing. The boy from Hell's Kitchen who had enlisted to serve his country had become something far greater than he could ever have imagined, but the essential values and commitments that had guided his journey remained unchanged even in his cosmic transformation. The dedication to protecting innocent people, the willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for larger purposes, and the understanding that freedom required constant vigilance had been constants throughout his extraordinary evolution from soldier to spy to director to cosmic guardian. The eternal watch that he now maintained was both the culmination of his life's mission and the beginning of a new form of service that would continue as long as there were threats to be monitored and people to be protected. The transformation that had seemed like punishment was revealed to be the ultimate expression of the commitment that had defined his entire existence, allowing him to continue his protective role on a scale and with a perspective that his mortal form could never have achieved. The story of Nick Fury had become legend, but the legend continued to live and breathe through the actions of those who carried forward his mission and methods. The Eternal Guardian watched over a universe that was safer because of his sacrifices, more hopeful because of his dedication, and more prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead because of the foundation he had helped create through a lifetime of service that had become a cosmic commitment to the protection of all that was good and worthy of preservation. And so we reach the end of our journey through the extraordinary life of Nicholas Joseph Fury, a man who began as a simple soldier from Hell's Kitchen and became one of the most influential figures in the Marvel Universe. From the battlefields of World War II to the cosmic threats of the modern age, Nick Fury has stood as humanity's shield against the darkness. His story reminds us that true heroism isn't found in superpowers or spectacular abilities, but in the willingness to sacrifice everything for others, to make the hard choices that others cannot, and to stand guard while the world sleeps. Though he may now watch from the shadows as the unseen, his legacy lives on in every agent he trained, every hero he guided, and every threat he neutralized before it could harm the innocent. Rest easy now, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, the eternal guardian continues his vigil, forever keeping watch over the world he swore to protect. Sleep well, and dream of better tomorrows made possible by those who stand guard in the night.